The mountain man found the widow feeding his old parents. What he did next changed her life forever. In the frozen silence of the Wild West winter, a lonely 25-year-old widow discovers two starving elders inside a snow-covered cabin. Unaware they are the parents of a feared mountain man who has been gone for weeks. Now let's dive into the story and find out what happened next. The snow had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in soft, endless sheets that blurred the world into white and silence. Even the wind seemed tired of howling, its breath slowing to a whisper between the pines. The Sierra Nevada in winter had a way of swallowing everything: sound, hope, and sometimes people. Evelyn Grace trudged through it anyway. She leaned forward into the storm, her shawl pulled tight around her face, the fabric stiff with frost. A wicker basket swung from her arm, a poor woman's offering of what little she had left: half a loaf of coarse bread, a small jar of broth, and 2 candles. Her boots were cracked at the seams, snow seeped in long ago. Each step made a soft crunch that vanished as soon as it came. Behind her, her cabin was a faint shadow against the storm. It had once been a preacher's house, her husband's, built by kind neighbors when they first arrived last spring. Back then, she believed God had sent them here to do good among the miners and trappers. But cholera had come first and taken him before the first frost. Now only she remained, clinging to his words and a fading sense of purpose. She might have stayed inside that day waiting for the storm to pass. But something, a feeling or maybe a prayer, had urged her to follow the faint tracks she'd seen behind her cabin the night before. Boot prints. Deep, uneven. Leading uphill into the woods where the snow grew thick as ash. Evelyn knew what it meant to find tracks in this kind of cold. Either someone was lost, or dying. She followed them, breath fogging the air. The trees closed in, tall firs coated in white, their branches bowing low like old men in prayer. Her skirts brushed against ice-heavy ferns. Her fingers, red and raw, clutched the basket tighter as wind cut through her wool dress. After an hour of climbing, she saw it. A low cabin crouched beneath a slope, its roof half collapsed under snow. No smoke. No sound. Just stillness and the faint smell of something long frozen, wood, iron, and the ghost of life. Evelyn hesitated. She'd been warned about cabins like this. Trappers sometimes left them as decoys or worse, graves. But she knocked anyway, 3 soft raps that echoed in the silence. No answer. She pushed the door open. The hinges groaned like something waking from a dream. Inside, it was dim and cold enough that her breath looked like smoke. An old stove stood in the corner, black with rust. A rifle leaned by the door. Furs hung stiff from the rafters. And on the bed near the fire pit, 2 shapes. Evelyn's heart stilled. A man and woman, old, thin as sticks, their faces hollow, skin gray under the weak light. The man's beard was white, tangled. The woman's hands clutched a wool blanket so tightly her knuckles had turned blue. For a terrible moment, Evelyn thought they were dead. Then the woman's eyes fluttered open. Her lips moved soundlessly, then a whisper broke the quiet. "Mercy." Evelyn dropped to her knees beside the bed. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're safe now." She unwrapped her shawl and laid it over the woman's chest. Her fingers worked fast, clearing a spot in the stove, pulling out the flint she carried in her pocket. The spark caught on dry moss. Soon a weak flame licked up, filling the cabin with a faint scent of smoke and pine. The old man stirred. His voice rasped like sandpaper. Who are you?" "Evelyn Grace," she said. "I live down the ridge. Found your tracks." He tried to sit, but his arms trembled and failed. "No one's come by in weeks." "I can see that," she murmured, ladling the broth into a tin cup from her basket. She held it to his lips. He sipped, coughing, then managed a grateful nod. The old woman took hers slower, tears slipping down her cheeks as she tasted the warmth. Evelyn noticed their fingers, blackened at the tips, frostbite. Their cheeks blistered from cold. The man's coat had holes big enough for wind to cut through. No food lay anywhere. No new wood. They'd been starving, freezing, forgotten. She worked fast. Pulled her gloves off. Chopped wood from the pile outside. Fed the fire. Melted snow in a kettle for water. When she finally sat back, hands trembling from exhaustion, she saw that the woman was smiling faintly. "You came like an angel," the old woman whispered. Evelyn shook her head. "No angels out here. Just folks trying not to freeze." But she looked around and saw something that made her pause. A man's coat, heavy and worn, hanging near the hearth. Beside it, a long knife gleamed faintly in the firelight. And on the mantel, a small wooden carving, a young man's face, square-jawed, hard-eyed. Evelyn touched the carving. "Your son?" she asked quietly. The old man's gaze flickered toward it. Jared. He's gone huntin', or maybe gone for good. Been near 3 weeks now. Evelyn set the carving down gently. Then I'll come till he returns. The old woman's fingers caught hers, cold and light as bird bones. Child, the snow'll kill you first. Then I'd rather it do that, Evelyn said, her voice steady, than know I left you to die here alone. Outside, the storm thickened again, a soft roar against the mountain's ribs. But inside that cabin, a fire burned for the first time in days. And in its flicker, Evelyn Grace, preacher's widow, stranger to this land, found something she hadn't felt since her husband's passing. Purpose. She didn't yet know whose parents she had just saved, or how deeply that single act of mercy would change both their lives forever. The next morning, dawn came gray and bitter, dragging mist through the trees like smoke. Evelyn woke stiff and sore, her arms aching from splitting wood and hauling water the night before. The inside of her cabin was cold as a tomb. Still, she rose, pulled on her threadbare coat, packed what little food she had left, and stepped into the snow. Each footfall crunched softly, the world muted under a sky heavy with new clouds. She knew the trail now, the dip where the creek froze solid, the twisted pine that leaned east like a crooked cross. She had no horse, only her own 2 legs and stubborn will. But something about those old folks in that cabin called her stronger than hunger or fear. By the time she reached them, the snow had drifted knee-high against the door. She pushed it open with her shoulder and found them where she'd left them, still breathing, still alive. The old woman stirred first. You came back, she whispered, voice thin but warm. Of course I did, Evelyn said with a small smile. I promised I would. She set her basket down on the table. A few biscuits, a jar of beans she'd managed to soak overnight, and a handful of dried apples. The old man, Tom, blinked at her as if unsure whether she was real or some fever dream the mountain had conjured. Evelyn worked quickly. She stoked the fire, swept out the ashes, and set a kettle over the flame. The air inside the cabin began to thaw, wood crackling and the smell of warmth replacing the scent of cold stone. She'd learned fast that mountain survival was rhythm, not strength. You rose before dawn, fed the fire, fetched the water, cooked what little you had, then gathered more before night fell. To fall behind even one day meant frostbite, hunger, or worse. As she moved, she began to notice details. The way Tom flinched when he heard a branch snap outside. The way Bess's eyes drifted to the mountains whenever the wind shifted. And the way a set of enormous snow boots rested by the door, dusted white and waiting. They had a son. Evelyn could see that plain as day. But the silence that fell whenever she glanced toward his things told her it wasn't a story often spoken aloud. That evening, after feeding them a thin stew of beans and dried venison, Evelyn sat by the fire to mend Tom's blanket. Her fingers moved slow but sure through the coarse fabric. You're not from here, are you? Bess asked, her voice cracking with age. No, Evelyn said softly. My husband and I came from Kansas last spring. He was a preacher. Bess nodded knowingly. One of them God men. Haven't seen many since the miners left. He believed even the roughest land could be redeemed, Evelyn said. He died believing it. The room fell quiet except for the pop of sap in the stove. Tom stared into the fire. You got the same look he did once. My boy Jared. Always fixin' what the world breaks. Till the world broke him back. Evelyn paused her stitching. Your son, he built this cabin? Tom nodded. Every board of it. Milled the wood by hand. Hunted the hills, trapped pelts, sent money down to the valley when times were good. Folks used to call him the ghost of Dry Creek Pass. The ghost? Tom's eyes flicked toward the window where the wind began to moan again. Men said he'd appear out of nowhere when a storm hit. Saved trappers from freezes, drove off thieves, once even scared a band of claim jumpers off a widow's land. But he got meaner as the years went by. Harder. Something about the mountain gets inside a man, makes him part of it. Cold and wild. Bess added quietly, he don't trust strangers anymore. Not since the war. Not since. Her voice broke and she looked away. Evelyn didn't press. Instead she rose and checked the stove. If he's still alive, he'll come back. Bess gave her a tired smile. He always does. Just not gentle. For the next week, Evelyn came every morning. Sometimes she brought firewood she'd split herself, her hands blistered and bleeding from the axe handle. Sometimes it was just a loaf of coarse bread or a jar of stew. She learned to walk the snow ridge sideways to keep from sinking. She wrapped her feet in wool rags when her boots gave out. And she learned to tell the hour by how the frost crept across the trees. One morning she found Bess humming softly as she stirred the fire, color returning to her cheeks. Tom had even managed to step outside and sit on the porch, watching the valley below shimmer in pale sunlight. It warmed Evelyn more than any fire could. "You've saved us," Bess said, tears welling. "We'd have froze without you." Evelyn smiled faintly. "No. The good Lord saved you. I just carried his basket." Tom chuckled low. "Sounds like a preacher's wife all right." When she left that afternoon, the sky had gone golden. She looked back once, saw the smoke rising straight from the chimney, curling into the quiet air, and felt something deep in her chest she hadn't felt in months. Belonging. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling she was being watched. Out there, somewhere in the timberline above, tracks appeared that hadn't been there the day before. Heavy boot prints. Fresh. And they led toward her trail. That night, Evelyn sat alone by her hearth, staring at the faint frost creeping across the window glass. She thought of Tom's stories, the mountain man who vanished for weeks, who hunted by moonlight and left no tracks unless he wanted them seen. A man who had learned to live without mercy. She whispered into the quiet, "If you're still out there, come home soon. They need you." Outside the wind shifted. And somewhere beyond the ridge, under the dark pines, a figure moved, tall, silent, and watching the same chimney smoke she'd just left behind. The ghost of Dry Creek Pass had returned. And by dawn he'd find a stranger tending his fire. The storm broke at last. For 2 days the wind eased and the snow softened to a crusted glitter that stretched across the valley like glass. The air was still, too still, the kind that makes animals burrow deep and every sound travel for miles. Evelyn noticed it as soon as she stepped outside that morning, the silence. No bird song. No cracking branch. Just the slow, steady drip of melting ice. It felt as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. She carried a basket of stew and biscuits, her scarf drawn high over her mouth, and followed the familiar trail up to the Harlan cabin. The snow squeaked under her boots, the faint sound swallowed by the pines. When she reached the clearing, smoke already rose from the chimney. Her heart skipped. She hadn't lit the fire yesterday. And Tom was far too weak to split wood alone. Evelyn hesitated, fingers tightening around the basket handle. The cabin door, which she'd closed firmly the day before, now stood slightly ajar. A faint scrape echoed from inside, the slow rasp of steel against steel. She stepped forward, the wood creaking under her weight. Inside the fire burned hot. Sparks jumped in the stove, filling the small room with an orange glow. Tom sat propped against his pillow, his eyes darting nervously between Evelyn and the man crouched near the stove, sharpening a knife. He was massive. Broad-shouldered, coat of bear hide draped over him like armor, his beard streaked with frost and years. His hands were thick and scarred, his eyes, dark and unreadable. The air around him carried the faint scent of smoke and pine pitch. Evelyn froze. Every tale she'd heard about the ghost of Dry Creek Pass came back to her in a rush. The man who once drove a band of outlaws from the ridge with only his axe and fury. The man who hadn't been seen in weeks. The man who now stood between her and the door. He didn't speak right away. Just looked her over, from her snow-stained skirts to her shaking hands. His gaze lingered on the basket. Finally, in a voice rough as gravel ground beneath boots, he said, "Who are you?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "My name's Evelyn Grace. I live down the ridge. I've been bringing your parents food." He set the knife down slow, eyes narrowing. "You been comin' here alone?" "Yes." "You been in my house, cookin' my fire, touchin' my things?" "I came because they were dying," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "No one else would help." Tom shifted weakly. "Jared." But his son raised a hand, not to strike, only to quiet. "Pa, I can see you're alive. Thanks to her, maybe. But you don't feed wolves and expect them to purr." Evelyn took a small step back. "I didn't come for thanks. Or to trespass." Jared's eyes flicked to the stove, then back to her. "Then why stay when you could have left him to the cold like the rest?" Evelyn met his gaze. "Because I couldn't." For a moment, silence. Only the soft hiss of the fire between them. Jared rose to his full height. The cabin seemed smaller for it, his head nearly brushing the beams, the air around him charged with quiet power. He walked to the window, pushed the shutter aside and looked out at the white wilderness. "When the storms hit," he said quietly, "the world don't care who lives or dies. I learned that long ago. And the mountain don't give mercy." "Then maybe it's time someone does," Evelyn said, surprising herself. He turned his head, not sharply, just enough for the firelight to catch one side of his face. A long scar crossed his jaw. His eyes were dark but not cruel. "Tired maybe. Wary." You talk like a preacher, he muttered. My husband was one, she answered softly. Before he passed. That seemed to silence him more than anything. His jaw shifted, unreadable. Then he walked past her, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and hung his coat on the peg by the door. Eat, he said gruffly to his parents. Then rest. Evelyn took it as her cue to leave. She turned toward the door, but Bess's frail voice stopped her. Child, you'll stay. You don't mean his bark. It's just the cold still on him. Evelyn hesitated. Jared didn't look at her, only poured water into the kettle with measured quiet. His hands were steady, his movements practiced. A man who'd lived too long alone. She stayed. They ate in near silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Tom dozed off halfway through his stew. Bess smiled faintly at her son, then at Evelyn, as if sensing something unseen beginning to shift in the room. After a while, Jared spoke again, voice low. The ridge trail's no place for a woman in winter. You ought to know that. I do, she said. But I came anyway. He grunted, not approval, not anger. Something in between. Fool's courage. Maybe, she said, but it kept your parents alive. That made him look at her fully, the first time since she'd entered. His eyes weren't the hard black she'd imagined from stories. They were brown, deep, with something haunted behind them. He set his bowl down and leaned back in his chair. Then I reckon I owe you, he said. You don't, she replied. He smirked faintly. You sound like you ain't used to being owed. She didn't answer. The silence stretched, filled with the faint hum of the stove and the steady tick of melting snow dripping from the roof. When Evelyn finally rose to leave, Jared followed her to the door. The wind outside cut sharp against her face. She turned back once, the firelight behind him throwing his shape across the snow like a long shadow. Be careful, Mrs. Grace, he said. The mountain's got teeth. So do I, she said softly and walked into the cold. That night, Jared watched her trail vanish down the ridge. He stood there long after she was gone, the wind biting at his skin, his breath steaming in the twilight. He'd been gone for weeks, chasing game and ghosts, certain the mountain had nothing left to surprise him. But the stranger who'd kept his parents alive, the preacher's widow with fire in her eyes, had done something he hadn't expected. She'd made his cabin feel human again. And though he didn't yet understand it, something deep in him stirred, not desire, not yet, but the first quiet ache of redemption. The days that followed fell into a kind of uneasy rhythm, one stitched together by necessity, silence, and the scrape of survival. Evelyn stayed. Not because Jared asked her to, he hadn't said more than a dozen words to her since that first night, but because Bess and Tom were still too weak to manage on their own. The thaw had not yet come. Snow still lay thick in the pines, the wind still bit through wood and wool, and the nearest town was a 3-day ride through ice and rock. So they existed together inside that little cabin on the ridge, 3 souls who had nearly perished, and one man who'd long forgotten how to share his fire. The shape of their days. Evelyn woke before dawn, always the first to rise. The air inside was sharp enough to sting her throat. She'd pull her shawl tight, kneel before the stove, and coax the fire back from its embers with pine shavings and breath. When it caught, the first hiss of flame filled the cabin with its fragile warmth, a promise that they'd made it through one more night. Jared would already be outside. She'd see his silhouette through the frosted window, a dark shape against the gray snow, splitting logs, each swing of his axe echoing like thunder in the valley. She'd watch him sometimes, though she tried not to. There was something almost frightening about the precision of his movements, not wild but controlled, like a man fighting the cold with the same focus he'd fight an enemy. The snow didn't seem to touch him. It clung to his coat, his beard, but he moved through it as if he'd become part of it. When he came in, the air would change. The cabin felt smaller when Jared was near, not from fear exactly but from presence. He carried the scent of pine smoke, iron, and wet fur. His boots thudded heavy against the floorboards. He spoke little, but his silence had weight. Evelyn learned to fill it. She cooked what she could, boiled roots, beans, bits of venison Jared brought from his traps. Sometimes she caught trout from the half-frozen creek, her fingers numb as she cleaned them. He never said thank you, but his bowl was always empty when she cleared it. The quiet war between them. One afternoon, as she mended Tom's torn shirt by the window, Jared came in with a pair of rabbit pelts over his shoulder. Snow crusted his coat, and a cut bled fresh across his forearm. "You're hurt," she said before she could stop herself. He glanced down, shrugged. "Trap spring caught me. Nothing to fret over. You'll infect it if you don't clean it." He frowned, that deep, mountain-born scowl of his. Been patching my own skin since I was 15, ma'am. And how's that worked for you? She asked, rising with the wash basin. For a heartbeat, his eyes held hers, dark, sharp, startled by the hint of wit. Then, to her surprise, he huffed a single breath of laughter. Fine, he muttered. Do what you will. She cleaned the wound gently, pressing a cloth soaked in whiskey against the gash. He didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. The muscles in his arm were corded like rope, scarred from old wounds that spoke of years living too close to danger. When she was done, she tied the bandage tight. You ought to be more careful, she said softly. Careful men don't last long up here, he replied. Then after a pause, but I'll try. It was the closest thing to gratitude she'd yet heard from him. A fire shared. That night, when the elders slept, Evelyn sat by the fire to mend her gloves. The room smelled of smoke and tallow, the snow outside whispering against the shutters. Jared sat across from her, carving something from a block of pine with his hunting knife, slow, deliberate strokes that filled the silence with soft shavings. After a long while he said without looking up, You could have gone back to town. Most would have. Why stay? She paused her stitching. Because I promised your mother I would. Promises are dangerous things, he muttered. So I've been told. He looked up then. The firelight caught the planes of his face, all hard edges and weathered lines, but something gentler behind the eyes. She said you're a preacher's widow. Evelyn nodded. Yes. He believed kindness could outlast cruelty. And you believe that too? She smiled faintly, though her voice held a tremor. I try. Even when the world makes it hard. Jared studied her a moment, then turned back to his carving. The world don't take kindly to soft hearts, Mrs. Grace. Then maybe it needs more of them, she said quietly. He didn't answer, but his hands slowed their carving. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, alive, like the hush after a hymn. The mountain's warning. The next morning, Jared went out before dawn to check his traps higher up the ridge. The wind howled all day, bending the trees sideways, sweeping snow like dust across the valley floor. By sundown he still hadn't returned. Bess grew anxious. Tom sat by the window watching the light fade from the peaks. Evelyn tried to keep the fire alive and their spirits higher, but each hour that passed without the crunch of boots outside tightened something in her chest. When he finally did return, it was near midnight. The door burst open, snow swirling in behind him. He staggered in, dragging a deer carcass through the threshold, his coat torn, his face white with cold. Storm hit faster and I reckoned, he muttered, dropping to his knees beside the fire. Evelyn rushed to help him pull the coat off. His hands were stiff and half frozen. She poured water, warmed a blanket, forced him to drink broth. He didn't protest this time, too tired, too near the edge. Could have died out there, she murmured as she worked. He managed a ghost of a smile. Wouldn't be the first time. She pressed her hand to his, warm against ice. Don't joke about that. His eyes lifted to hers. For a moment, neither moved. The firelight flickered between them, her breath shallow, his eyes dark but softened, seeing her not as a stranger but something else entirely. Something human. When he finally slept, she sat by the hearth watching him breathe. His parents rested peacefully nearby, their faces lined but content. Outside, the mountain groaned under fresh snow, but the cabin's fire burned steady, steady as her resolve. Evelyn had come to feed two strangers. Now she found herself keeping alive the very man the mountain feared most. And though she didn't yet understand it, that same mountain, that cruel, cold land, was slowly melting around them both. The storm that had clawed at the cabin for days finally broke. When the dawn came, it came sharp and dazzling, sunlight bouncing off a world of white. The pines glistened under their frozen crowns, and the whole valley lay hushed as if holding its breath. Jared stood in the doorway, his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the ridge line. Snow's heavy, he muttered. Could bring the bears down early. Evelyn paused with a kettle in her hands. Bears? This early in the season? They stir when the thaw comes sudden. Food scarce. Makes 'em mean. She swallowed. And you're going out there anyway? He glanced back at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging his beard. Ain't no choice. Meat won't walk through the door. Then, softer, keep the fire high till I'm back. He turned and disappeared into the morning glare, his boots crunching through the crusted snow until he vanished between the pines. The quiet before the cry. Hours passed. Evelyn busied herself with chores, sweeping the floor, boiling broth, mending socks. Yet every sound from outside made her pause. The wind carried strange echoes through the trees this time of year, cracking branches, shifting ice, things that sounded almost alive. By afternoon the old couple had dozed by the fire. Evelyn stepped outside to fetch water from the half-frozen creek. The air was bitter, biting through her shawl. She broke the ice with a stick and filled her bucket, the surface shimmering like glass. That was when she heard it. A gunshot. Then a second, farther off, muffled by the woods. And then, silence. Her heart froze before her body did. She dropped the bucket, water spilling across her boots, and started running, skirts whipping against her legs, breath coming in harsh clouds. She didn't think, only moved, following the echoes between the trees. The trail of Red. She found him not far from the upper ridge. The snow around him was torn and stained, red against white like spilled wine. Jared lay half-slumped beside a fallen spruce, his rifle several feet away, his left arm bleeding from a ragged gash. A few yards away a bear, massive, brown and still, lay sprawled in the snow, its chest heaving one final shuddering breath before going still. Evelyn's scream came out as a gasp. "Jared! Oh Lord, Jared!" He stirred, tried to speak, but the sound was lost in a cough. His face was pale under the grime and blood. The sleeve of his coat was shredded. "I got it, but it got me too," he rasped. "Don't you dare close your eyes," she said fiercely, already tearing strips from her skirt to bind his arm. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "You're not dying out here." He tried to protest, but she glared at him, the same look she'd once given wayward boys in Sunday school. "Save your strength." When she tied the makeshift bandage, she slipped under his arm, trying to lift him. "You'll never make it hauling me," he groaned. "Then I'll drag you," she snapped. "Now hush." And she did. It took nearly an hour, through snow, blood, and sheer stubborn will. Her back burned, her lungs screamed, and more than once she nearly slipped. But every time Jared sagged, she gritted her teeth and whispered, "Not yet. Not today." By the time the cabin came into view, her skirts were frozen stiff, her hands raw, and her body shaking. But Jared was alive. That was all that mattered. The long night. Inside, she rolled him before the fire and cut away his torn coat. The wound on his shoulder was deep, a claw mark that had nearly taken him apart. She cleaned it with boiling water and whiskey, pressing rags against it while he gritted his teeth in silence. "You should have let me be," he said through a groan. "And leave you to freeze? I'm not that kind of woman. You might wish you were before this is over." But she didn't stop. She stitched the wound with shaking fingers and the last of his mother's sewing thread, whispering prayers under her breath. When it was done, she covered him in blankets and fed him spoonfuls of hot broth. All through the night, she sat beside him, wiping the sweat from his face as fever set in. He drifted in and out, sometimes mumbling her name, sometimes words that made no sense at all. Once he opened his eyes, the firelight flickering in their depths. "You saved me," he whispered. She smiled faintly, exhaustion dulling her voice. "You'd have done the same." His lips twitched. "Maybe. But I'd have cursed the heavens first. Then I'm glad I didn't." A crack in the armor. When morning came, the fever broke. Jared slept deeply, his face calm for the first time since she'd met him. Bess sat beside him, holding his hand, tears running freely down her cheeks. Evelyn stood back, rubbing her aching arms, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself in years, relief. She turned toward the window. The sun was rising over the ridge, turning the world gold. Steam curled from the kettle. The cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and life. Behind her, Jared stirred. His voice, rough but steady, filled the quiet. "You're a stubborn woman, Evelyn Grace." She turned, smiling faintly. "So I've been told." He met her gaze, and for the first time, the hardness in his face cracked. There, beneath the scars and the beard and the mountain's weight, was something she hadn't expected: warmth. "You've got no reason to keep staying," he said softly. "But I'm glad you did." She said nothing, just went back to tending the fire, her cheeks burning hotter than the coals. Outside, the snow was already melting, the sound of dripping water marking the slow approach of spring. And inside that little cabin, beneath the smoke and the silence, something else was thawing too, a bond neither of them had meant to build, but one the mountain itself seemed to bless. Spring came slow to the Sierra Nevada. Not in color at first, just in sound. The groan of shifting ice. The steady drip of meltwater through the pines. The whisper of wind that no longer froze the breath on your lips. For the first time in months, the mountain smelled faintly of earth instead of death. Inside the cabin, the days stretched quieter but warmer. Jared's wound had scabbed over, leaving a dark scar down his shoulder. He was still thin, still tired, but his strength returned with each sunrise. Evelyn caught herself watching him more than she should, the way he moved again with quiet certainty, how he lifted wood one-handed, or carried water from the creek without complaint. The mountain man was mending, in more ways than one. A new routine. They worked together now. The cabin's roof had sagged from the heavy snows, so Jared climbed up to patch it while Evelyn passed him strips of bark and pitch. When they were done, they stood side by side, watching the smoke from the chimney coil into the pale sky. "You ever done roof work before?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No, but I'm learning fast." He grunted, a trace of humor in it. "You learn quick for a preacher's widow." "Survival's a good teacher," she said. "And so's necessity." He looked at her for a long moment, not speaking but seeing her. There was no pity in his gaze, only quiet respect. The run to Carson's Fork. Supplies were running thin. Flour, salt, even powder for Jared's rifle were nearly gone. The nearest trading post was at Carson's Fork, a half-day ride through muddy, half-melted terrain and swollen creeks. Evelyn insisted on going with him. "It's too dangerous," Jared told her, saddling his horse. "The river's high, and that road turns to muck when it thaws." "I've crossed worse on foot with a bucket," she replied, adjusting her shawl. "You're not leaving me behind." He sighed, realizing argument was useless. "You ever ride before?" She hesitated. "Not since my husband passed." Jared gave her a nod and lifted her up onto his horse, his hands rough but careful. "Then hold on tight." The trail was a mess of mud, melting snow and jagged stone. They rode in silence for most of the way, the forest dripping around them. Ravens watched from the branches. The air smelled of thaw and pine sap. At one point, the horse stumbled in a deep rut, and Evelyn's hands tightened on Jared's coat. She felt the heat of him, solid and unflinching. "Easy," he murmured, not to the horse but to her. "I got you." For reasons she couldn't explain, that simple phrase sank deeper than it should have. The river crossing. By mid-afternoon they reached the fork, a river swollen to twice its winter width, roaring with meltwater. The bridge was gone, washed clean away. Jared studied the torrent. "We'll have to ford it." Evelyn's face went pale. "That current'll sweep us off before we're halfway." "Not if we time it right," he said, already tightening the straps on the saddlebags. "We go slow, angled upstream. Trust the horse's footing." "Trust?" she muttered. "Easy for you to say." He looked at her, then really looked. "You've got more grit than most men I've met, Evelyn. But I need you to believe in me now." And she did. Because somehow, against all reason, she did trust him. They entered the river. The water bit like knives, rising to the horse's belly, then its chest. The current tugged hard, trying to drag them downstream. Evelyn clung to Jared's coat, praying under her breath. Halfway across, the horse stumbled. Evelyn screamed, the world tilting. Jared twisted, one arm locking around her waist, holding her upright. "Stay with me," he shouted over the roar. They made it through, soaked to the bone, shivering, but alive. On the far bank, Evelyn slid down, legs trembling. She laughed, breathless, wild, half in disbelief. Jared looked at her, eyes narrow but bright, the hint of a grin beneath his beard. "You did good," he said. "I nearly drowned," she shot back, still laughing. "Still counts as good." It was the first time they'd laughed together, the sound awkward, rusty but real. The kind of sound that felt like it didn't belong in a place so used to silence. The long ride home. By the time they reached the cabin again, the sun was bleeding orange across the peaks. They unpacked their supplies, started a fire, and hung their wet clothes by the hearth. Bess and Tom were asleep early, worn from the day's warmth. The cabin glowed in quiet light, wood crackling, water dripping softly from their boots. Evelyn sat across from Jared, drying her hair with a towel. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For not letting go." He met her eyes, tired, raw but kind. "Didn't plan on it." They sat in silence after that, watching the flames dance. Outside, the mountain sighed with melting snow. The world that had been locked in ice for months was waking again. Jared leaned back, the firelight tracing the scars across his face. "I used to think the mountain was all I needed," he said quietly. "And now?" He hesitated. "Now I ain't so sure." Evelyn didn't answer. She just looked into the fire, her hand resting near his on the table. Not touching, not yet. But close enough for warmth to bridge the space between them. Outside, the river ran freer. Inside, something else began to do the same. The thaw came slow that year, but it came. Snow gave way to mud, mud to grass, and soon the meadows at the base of the ridge were greening. The mountains still wore their white crowns, but the valleys began to breathe again. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life shifted. The elders grew weaker, not from hunger this time but from the quiet, natural slipping of age. Bess's laughter became softer. Tom's hands trembled when he lifted his coffee mug. They had lived through the worst of the winter, but both seemed to sense their season was closing. Evelyn felt it too. Every time she brought them tea or tucked the quilts around their thin shoulders, she caught Jared watching her. His face drawn, his eyes carrying something unspoken. He'd faced wolves, storms, and hunger without fear. But the thought of losing his parents made him small again, just a boy trapped inside the body of a weathered man. The fading light. One evening, Bess called Evelyn to her bedside. The room was lit only by a single oil lamp. Outside, the night hummed with crickets, the first Evelyn had heard since arriving on the mountain. "My Jared," Bess whispered, her voice papery as dried leaves. "He's always carried the mountain inside him. Hard and cold. But you," her frail hand found Evelyn's. "You brought the thaw." Evelyn's eyes filled. "He saved me too, Bess. More than he knows." Bess smiled faintly. "Then promise me you'll tell him. When I'm gone, tell him not to stay alone again." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. By dawn, Bess was gone, her face peaceful, her hands still warm in her son's. Tom wept quietly by the fire, and Jared sat for hours on the cabin step, staring out at the mist curling over the valley. He didn't speak all that day. Not a word. But when he finally came back inside, his eyes were different, hollow but no longer hardened. He looked at Evelyn as though truly seeing her for the first time. The breaking point. A few nights later, a storm rolled through, not of snow this time but of rain and thunder that shook the rafters. Evelyn was mending clothes when she found Jared outside, standing in the downpour beside his mother's grave, his hat off, rain running down his face like tears. She stepped out, the mud sucking at her boots. "You'll catch your death," she called. He didn't turn. Already been close enough to it. She moved closer, her skirt plastered to her legs, lightning flashing across the valley. "Jared." He turned then, his voice breaking open. "I wasn't here when she fell sick. I stayed out huntin', hidin' from the world. Thought I was keepin' them safe by stayin' away. But all I did was let him suffer alone. You came back," she said softly. "That's what matters." He shook his head. "No. You came back. You, a stranger, showed more mercy than their own son." She reached up, her hand against his chest, feeling the roughness of his coat, the hammering of his heart beneath it. "You don't owe me thanks, Jared. You just have to live different now." For a long time neither moved. Rain hissed on the stones, thunder rumbled far off, and his hand came up slowly to cover hers. His voice dropped low. "I don't know how." "You start by letting someone in," she whispered. The morning after. The storm passed. Sunlight returned, filtering through the pines, turning the wet earth to steam. Jared rose early, cut wildflowers from the slope, and placed them on the grave. Evelyn stood nearby, watching. The air smelled of wet grass and pine needles, the scent of renewal. When he turned to her, something had settled in his face, not sorrow, not hardness. "I've been thinkin'," he said quietly. "Once we lay my father to rest beside her, there'll be no one left but me up here. You don't owe this mountain a thing. You could go back to town. Start over." She studied him, the morning wind catching her shawl. "And what about you?" He hesitated. "I reckon I'll stay. The land still needs tending." Her lips curved in a soft, knowing smile. "Then I reckon you'll need help." He blinked, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping him. "You'd stay? After all this?" Evelyn looked past him, toward the peaks glowing gold in the distance. "This place tried to kill me, but it also gave me back my faith. And maybe, it gave me a reason to keep fighting." Something in Jared broke then, the last wall between them. He stepped closer, his voice rough. "You deserve more than a man like me." She shook her head. "Maybe what I deserve is a man who's learned what mercy feels like." For the first time, Jared Harlan smiled, not the sharp smirk of the mountain man, but something deep and human. He took her hand, his thumb brushing the scar on her palm where she'd once burned it on the stove. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life earning that mercy," he said quietly. Epilogue, the ridge in bloom. By summer, wildflowers had blanketed the meadow below the cabin. The graves on the ridge were marked with hand-carved stones, and between them stood a small wooden cross Evelyn had made herself. The cabin had new shutters, a fresh roof, and laughter in its walls. Evelyn planted herbs by the door. Jared built a small corral. Together they rebuilt a life, not out of romance at first, but out of shared work, respect, and a slow, growing warmth neither of them had known they could still feel. Some evenings, when the sun dipped low and the light hit the peaks just right, Jared would stand behind her on the porch, his arms around her waist, their shadows stretching long across the grass. He'd murmur, voice low as the wind, "Never thought I'd find peace up here." And Evelyn would smile, resting her head against his chest. "You didn't find it, Jared. You built it." The mountain, once cruel and silent, seemed softer now, its streams laughing, its air sweet with pine and promise. And though the world below might never know their names, high on that ridge in the Sierra Nevada, two weary souls had found the rarest thing of all, a second chance.